we go. Now you can hear me. Thank you, Leah. That was really beautiful. And this is that time of year when we're called to honor the dark. And if I think about 2020, as you've been hanging out with me, my name is Reverend Alice Reid, and I'm here at the Center for Spiritual Living Santa Cruz, and all year we've been navigating some very unusual territory, wouldn't you say? And so when I think about 2020 and I think about all the events that have transpired over the last 9 months since the coronavirus has sort of turned the world up on its axis, I want to ask you a question. How are you doing? I know I can't hear your answer because we can't be together, but I really want you to reflect on this. I want you to consider, how have you been faring over these last 9 months? It's not been an easy time for us. And as we move into this time of honoring the dark, of really gleaning from what this time in our own lives, in our nation, in our world, and really gleaning what it is that's come up for us, this is a time for us to do some deep reflection. And we're starting December by looking at the shadow. Jacob Lieberman, a renowned author and scientist and metaphysician, talks about the shadow in his writing. Now, what you need to know about Jacob is that he started out as an optometrist and then moved into a more scientific study of light and how light was refracted through vision, and began to see the ramifications of the metaphysical meaning of how light moves through us. And so he writes this about the shadow. A shadow is produced when an object blocks light. Whenever we block the light guiding our life, we create a shadow. Only when we are transparent and in alignment with the source of light, as when the sun is directly overhead, does the shadow magically disappear. Recognizing the shadow can be this catalyst towards change and enlightenment. It's our tool to use, not to hide from, not to avoid, but to lean into and to really begin to see what is in that earthy thing we call the shadow in our subconscious that wants to really guide us forward. Lieberman goes on to say that what we call our shadow is nothing more than an aspect of our nature waiting to be embraced and reclaimed. And so as a teaching of wholeness, as a teaching, a non-dualistic teaching, as we look at spirituality, we may talk about the light and the dark, but they are simply two sides of the same thing. And so what is it about us that we are very eager to embrace the light and shun the darkness? There are many faith traditions that have honored the darkness, have understood that this was really the rich loam of creation that was wanting to come forward. I have my talk title today is from Matthew Fox. It's actually a direct quote from him. He's a progressive theologian and historian, and he said, a pandemic is a terrible thing to waste. And I'm here to tell you that let's not waste this pandemic. This is rich, fertile ground for us to move through. Now, I came across this quote because Matthew Fox has written a book that's just come out called Julian of Norwich, and he studies this 14th century mystic who lived through almost 50 years of the Black Plague. Now, it's common knowledge that the Black Plague lasted for an extended period of time, but when you really look it up, there were certain cities where that were on ports that the sailors would come and they would be reinfected over and over again. And Julianne lived through almost 50 years of pandemic. And she had visions and she had insights. And so what Matthew has tried to do in his book is to really begin to look at the parallels between what Julianne learned and what we can learn from our own experiences with the pandemic. And I was really struck as I was looking at his writing, and as I'm actually taking a class with him online, and I was really struck with this observation that during that time in humans' history, during that time when we had great losses and lots of suffering, that it created this kind of massive cultural trauma. How could it not? 1 in 3 people died, and if you got sick with the Black Plague, you could be dead by the next day. It was devastating to Europe. The authorities of the day, being uneducated, I'll put it that way, not really understanding where this plague was coming from, tried to blame it on the heavens. A kind of punishment from God. And some historians place this Black Plague at a pivotal time when Christian mystics were really teaching about the divinity of all life, that God is in everything and that is creating out of its love. And yet the world was experiencing this massive devastation through there was climate change that was happening in Asia. There was the Black Plague that was, devastating the world. And so many of the religious leaders of the day began to preach that the only hope for humanity and its evil nature was redemption through the church. Now, I bring this up to you because this is a huge shadow that was created in the 14th, 15th century around the end of the medieval ages and the Middle Ages, and it was what was the energy that was shepherding us into the modern era. And so if you look around today, I think it's quite obvious, at least it is to me, as I do, now of course this is all studied observation, there's no one can know for sure, but it certainly seems to me that the beautiful teaching that the master teacher, Jesus of Nazareth, brought to the planet somehow got twisted up to become this idea of sin and the devil and evil and needing to be redeemed, as opposed to, as Matthew Fox would say, being born into original blessing. Matthew Fox calls this creation spirituality. And I think it's when we look at a lot of what Matthew Fox teaches with creation spirituality, it's very much in concert with what we teach. And so if we think about the impact that the communal shadow can have on society and create the culture and morph or warp things, then it begs us to pay attention to our own shadows. Each of us has a part in creating the collective ideas of our culture. The world needs your healing presence. The world needs your clear consciousness. And so our invitation as we find ourselves in this really unusual place in history is to do the deep reflection, to begin to acquaint yourself with your own shadow, to begin to look at what it is that you might be suppressing through your own challenges, trauma, if you will, given what we've experienced in 2020. I mean, it's how many, quadruple whammy. I mean, we have we have disease, we have political unrest, we have racial unrest, we have economic unrest. I'm sure I'm forgetting something because there's been so many crazy things happening this year that the hits just keep coming. And it's human nature for us to just pack those things, push them down, push them down below the surface. But I want to say that as a culture and as individuals who understand that our thoughts create, we have an opportunity to ride the front of that wave to creating what's next for us as a civilization, what's next for us as humanity. Now, I know this sounds like, yeah, it's all up to you. I know it sounds like a lot, but it's really not that complicated. So I thought I would get a little vulnerable with you and talk to you about my own shadow and the things that I've, at least one thing because we'd be here all day if I told you all the things I found in my shadow. Well, I'll at least share a little bit about my own experiences. I was formally introduced to shadow work probably 12, 15 years ago, but I've been doing some level of it through the 12-step recovery work that I do for almost 40 years now. And what I've discovered about working with my own shadow is that if I can pay attention to those places where I have emotional triggers, there's often, rather than something that I'm reacting to in the present, there's often a filter from my past that I'm reacting to. And so if the emotional triggers, that oh darn, I can't believe this is happening moment that I have, whether it's in a relationship or watching something that's happening in the world, if I can watch those emotional triggers as they come up, then I know they're clues for something that, maybe there's a wire that's crossed within me, something that happened a long time ago that is informing my relationship to the present circumstances that are happening around me. So one of my triggers is that I don't like making mistakes. Imagine that. And those that are here in the room know me well and have seen me triggered by feeling wrong about something and then really doing my best not to have that experience. Often I'll try to soften things and I'll try to make excuses for mistakes that are made. I'll go so far as to make mistakes for other people's behavior and make excuses for other people's behavior. And this is what happens for me when I really examine this, when I look at where the wires are crossed. What happens for me is that when I'm really at my highest and best, I'm acting out of love and compassion, self-love and self-compassion. But when I'm unconscious, it shows up as defensiveness and resistance and irritability. And when I bring those negative shadow characteristics into a relationship or a situation unconsciously, well, then I'm actually creating out of that space. And what I know is that we were born, each one of us, to express in high, holy ways that spirit has these immutable qualities of love and freedom and wholeness and beauty that it just wants to create by means of us. And then our shadow kind of stands in front of that light so that instead of expressing love and freedom and wholeness and beauty and joy, I'm expressing something that's not so much like those things. And it can be quite unlovely, and it's creative in its nature. I hope this is making sense to you. And I hope that you can see that just by paying attention to your own reactions and paying attention to your own emotional triggers, you can actually shift what you create in the world. It does take a little bit of work, but as Matthew Fox said so beautifully, a pandemic is a terrible thing to waste. We've all got a lot of emotional things going on right now. And so as light workers, as individuals who really understand that the heart is the alchemist that takes our mind and our feelings and helps us to really create from a clear and holy way, as knowing that, why wouldn't we want to do this beautiful shadow work so that we could really integrate whatever it is we're trying to avoid? You know, there's a saying, you've probably heard it: what you resist persists. And so the shadow work is really about integration. It's not about beating yourself up. It's not about, calling yourself out and letting everybody else know what a unlovely person you have been in a certain situation. It's not about shame. It's about wholeness and clarity. And when we can be really clear about what it is that we want to create, well, if you've been around this philosophy for any period of time, what you know is that it is the clarity that creates. That when I'm clear about what it is at that level of conscious awareness, life just unfolds gracefully. It's almost like magic. Now, there's a lot of great literature out there about shadow work. There's a lot of wonderful practices. And it can be tempting, especially in a time like this, when we have been through so much. There has been so much upheaval. There has been so much breaking apart. There has been so much heartache. There's been so much anger, especially in a time like this. It's tempting to want to bypass the shadow work and to just call it all good. Pray it away, if you will. That, my friends, is the spiritual bypass. And what that does is it represses what needs to be integrated. And what I know about the darkness, if you think about it from a gardening metaphor, like the soil that we plant our seeds in is so rich. It has all the nutrients that are needed for a little hard seed to burst open. And from this tiny little seed comes this huge, beautiful plant. It has to work its way up through the dirt. It has to crest through the surface, and then it begins to have life and bloom. And so our shadow work is much like that. It's not easy. Sometimes it's uncomfortable, but it's what's needed to crack us open so that we can really blossom, so that we can really be who we wanted to be, who we decided to be before we even incarnated. Each of us has a mission. And I believe that that mission is love in one form or another. And so the shadow work is the work of coalescing that forward. It's very worthwhile. And so my invitation to you is to ask yourself 3 questions. What gets your attention quickest? What snaps you to attention? And then the second question is, where do you find yourself getting the most emotional? If you take what grabbing your attention and what's really making you the most emotional, and then third, if you allow yourself to really feel that emotion, and then getting quiet and asking yourself, what is my earliest memory of this emotion? And when you get quiet, you should simply take a deep breath. You can ask your higher wisdom self to guide you. The wisdom is within you, like the wisdom is in the seed, in the soil, that is ready to be broken open, is ready to come to the surface, is ready to blossom. And so this month, as we begin to honor the dark, as we begin to really appreciate what the dark is doing for us, and when you think about the examples of Mother Nature, it more on the East Coast than the West Coast, but oftentimes life begins to almost disappear. The trees lose all their leaves, and we're left with what looks very barren and cold and bland and dark. But there's a lot happening under the ground. There's a lot cooking in the soil. And so what we're going to do for the month of December is that we're going to do some reflection. We're going to look at what it is that we're ready to release. We're going to look at what we want to integrate. That's the work that you could do at home while you're in this shelter in place, while we're staying home, while we're staying away from each other. This is a great opportunity for you to really reflect on what you've been through over the last 9 months, to let yourself have the feelings and to move through them, to see what is growing inside of you, so that you can be part of this creation spirituality, if you will, and begin to create from clarity and from wholeness. Indeed, a pandemic is a terrible thing to waste, and I hope you'll join us over the next couple of weeks as we press in. And we'll do this with gentleness. I know there'll be some tender places that you might touch, but know that we are holding you, our practitioners, our ministers, we are holding you in love. And it is love that will carry us through this time this time of being apart, this time of challenge, this time of uncertainty. There's something really beautiful that's happening right now. And so my invitation is for you to be present with it. And so with that, I think it's time for us to pray. So if you'll join me by taking a deep breath. And it is in the exhalation that we recognize that we are present with the one power, the one soul existence that creates out of itself, that creates by means of loving itself so much that it comes into form as you, as me, as our world. And so I know as we stand at the threshold of this time in the history of the world, that each one of us does so, allowing our heart to guide us, knowing that there is inner wisdom that is simply available for the asking. We need only ask for help. We need only ask the question and sit still long enough to hear the answer. And so I trust each one is guided, guarded, and protected as we move through this time of the long nights toward the return of the light, knowing that that light is ready to move as us, move through us, move by us, so that the world indeed can have the experience of blossoming, of shift, of evolutionary change, so that the love that is creation can reign supreme, can walk the planet. How else can love experience life except by means of you? And so, dear ones, I know that we accept this beautiful mission, knowing that all is available, that we are completely resourced, and I give great thanks for that. And together we anchor this in love by saying, and so it is. Thank you.